The White House just made a request that stopped a lot of people cold. $200 billion. That's the number being floated for a potential military operation involving Iran. And at almost the exact same moment that number entered the public conversation, J.D. Vance was standing in front of cameras making a confession that most Americans were not prepared to hear. Gas prices are going to keep going up. Not maybe, not possibly, not if things go wrong. Going up. Those two moments, the $200 billion war request and the gas price admission, didn't happen in isolation. They happened together, within the same news cycle, within the same political conversation. And that combination is exactly why millions of people are now asking a very uncomfortable question. What is actually happening right now? Because this isn't a story about one number or one statement. This is a story about a pattern. A series of decisions and admissions that are starting to form a picture that a lot of people don't like what they see. And to understand why this moment hit so differently than previous political news cycles, you have to go back to what people were promised. Not long ago, the central economic message coming from this administration was clear and specific. Prices were going to come down. The cost of living was going to be addressed. Ordinary Americans who had been struggling at the gas pump and in the grocery store were finally going to get relief. That wasn't a vague promise. It was a specific, repeated, loudly stated commitment. And now the Vice President of the United States is on camera saying gas prices will continue to spike. Let that land for a moment. This isn't an opponent saying it. This isn't a hostile journalist speculating. This is J.D. Vance himself, the second most powerful person in the American government, saying directly that prices are going up. And he said it in the same news cycle as a $200 billion war budget request. That timing is not an accident, and it's not going unnoticed. Let's talk about the $200 billion number first, because the scale of it requires some context. $200 billion is not a routine military appropriation. It is not a standard defense budget line item. It is an extraordinary sum of money being requested for what would be an extraordinarily consequential military operation. For reference, the entire annual GDP of many mid-sized countries doesn't reach $200 billion. The amount being discussed for a potential Iran conflict is larger than the yearly economic output of nations with tens of millions of people. That's the scale we're talking about. And the request didn't come quietly. It came as tensions in the region had already been escalating for months. As diplomatic channels were narrowing. As the language coming out of Washington about Iran was becoming increasingly direct and increasingly urgent, so when the $200 billion figure entered the conversation, it didn't feel like a theoretical planning exercise to most people paying attention. It felt like a number attached to something real. Something that could actually happen. And the question that immediately followed was the same question it always is when governments start talking about this kind of money. Who is paying for it? Because $200 billion doesn't appear from nowhere. It comes from somewhere. It gets allocated, borrowed, redirected. It has consequences for budgets, for deficits, for the financial decisions that affect everyday life. And everyday life is already under serious pressure. Which is where J.D. Vance's gas price admission becomes so significant. Because Vance didn't just say prices might go up. He said they will continue to spike. The language was forward-looking and definitive. Not hedged, not softened with qualifications. Will continue. That's a statement of expectation, not a warning about a possibility. And coming from the vice president, it carries a specific kind of weight. It means the people at the top of this government are looking at the data, looking at the projections, and concluding that relief is not coming. At least not in the near term. For millions of Americans who are already making painful choices about how to spend their money, that admission is not an abstraction. It's a direct statement about their lives. Their commutes, their heating bills, their grocery runs, every decision that involves fuel costs in any way. And those decisions affect almost everything. Now, some political analysts have pushed back on the framing around Vance's comments. They've argued that he was being honest about global market conditions that no single government can fully control. That oil prices are determined by international factors, geopolitical pressures, and supply decisions made by foreign actors. That's a legitimate argument. It has real merit. But here's where it gets complicated. The same administration that is now explaining why it can't control gas prices has been simultaneously pursuing a foreign policy in the Middle East that directly affects the global oil market. Iran is one of the world's significant oil producers. Any military conflict involving Iran, any serious escalation of tensions, any disruption to the regional stability that oil markets depend on, will have immediate and severe consequences for global energy prices. That's not speculation. That's how energy markets have operated for decades. So when the White House is requesting $200 billion for an Iran operation and the Vice President is simultaneously confirming that gas prices will keep rising, those two things are not separate stories. They are the same story. And the connection between them is exactly what's driving the intensity of the public reaction right now. Because people are doing the math. And the math is not reassuring. A potential military engagement with Iran. $200 billion in requested funding. Gas prices confirmed to be heading higher. All arriving in the same news cycle. That's not a coincidence. That's a policy direction. And millions of Americans who voted on economic promises are now sitting with the gap between what they were told and what they're being told now. Let's talk about what a potential Iran conflict would actually mean at the pump. The relationship between Middle East instability and American gas prices is one of the most well-documented connections in modern economic history. Every major conflict or serious escalation in that region over the past 50 years has produced measurable effects on oil prices globally. The 1973 oil embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the 2019 attacks on Saudi oil facilities. Every single time, the instability translated into price shocks at gas stations across America. Sometimes moderate, sometimes severe, but always real, always felt. A conflict involving Iran specifically would be particularly significant because of Iran's geographic position. The Strait of Hormuz, which runs along Iran's coastline, is one of the most critical choke points in global oil transportation. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it. 20%. If that strait were disrupted in any serious way, the effects on global oil markets would be immediate and severe. We're not talking about a gradual price increase over months. We're talking about the kind of shock that gets felt within days. And the people who would feel it most are not the people with stock portfolios and investment accounts. They're the people who drive to work every morning. The people who heat their homes with oil. The people who are already calculating how far their paycheck has to stretch. Which is exactly the constituency that this administration built its electoral success on. That tension, between the foreign policy being pursued and the economic promises that were made to the people who made this administration possible, is not a small political problem. It's a fundamental contradiction. And J.D. Vance, to his credit in some observers' eyes, at least acknowledged part of it on camera. But acknowledgement and solution are very different things. And right now, there's a lot of acknowledgement and not much visible solution. Let's zoom out further, because this moment exists within a larger context that makes it even more significant. The American public's relationship with military spending and foreign intervention has been complicated for a long time. The experiences of the past 2 decades, the long wars, the enormous costs, the complicated outcomes, left a significant portion of the American population deeply skeptical of large military commitments abroad. That skepticism exists across party lines. It's not a left or right position. It's a broadly felt wariness about what happens when the United States commits hundreds of billions of dollars to military operations in complex regions. And $200 billion for an Iran operation is not a small commitment. It's the kind of number that would represent one of the largest single military expenditures in American history. For a public already carrying economic anxiety, already feeling the pressure of elevated prices, already uncertain about their financial futures, that number lands differently than it might have in a different economic moment. It lands as a question. A very direct, very personal question. Why is this the priority? That question doesn't have an easy answer. And the fact that it's being asked simultaneously with a gas price admission makes it harder to answer, not easier. Because the argument for military action, the national security argument, the deterrence argument, the regional stability argument, all of those require a public that trusts the economic management of the people making those arguments. And that trust is currently being tested. J.D. Vance occupies a specific and unusual position in this moment. He is simultaneously one of the architects of the economic messaging that brought this administration to power and one of the people now having to explain why that messaging isn't translating into the outcomes that were promised. That's a difficult position to be in publicly. And the gas price admission, whatever the strategic logic behind making it, has created a narrative that is going to be very hard to escape. Because once you're on camera saying prices will continue to spike, that clip exists. It gets replayed. It gets combined with other clips. It becomes part of the story that gets told about this moment in American politics. Not just by opponents, by everyone watching. And the $200 billion war request sitting right next to it in the same news cycle doesn't soften that story. It intensifies it. This is the moment that historians of this period will look back at as a turning point in the public conversation. Not necessarily a turning point in policy. Not necessarily a turning point in the political fortunes of the people involved. But a turning point in the conversation. The moment when the economic promises and the foreign policy ambitions came into visible, public, undeniable tension with each other. And the moment when the American people started asking, out loud and at scale, whether those two things can actually coexist. That question doesn't have a clean answer today, but it's being asked now in a way it wasn't being asked 3 months ago. And in politics, the questions that get asked publicly have a way of demanding answers eventually. There's another layer to this story that isn't getting enough attention. The domestic political math. Because the people who are most directly hurt by rising gas prices are not evenly distributed across the political map. They're concentrated in specific places, specific communities, specific states that played an outsized role in recent electoral outcomes. Rural communities, suburban working families, people who drive long distances to work because they can't afford to live close to where the jobs are. People for whom a 20 or 30 cent increase at the pump isn't an inconvenience. It's a budget crisis. These are not abstract statistics. These are real households making real calculations every single week. And a lot of those households were part of the coalition that put this administration in power. Which means the gas price admission isn't just an economic story. It's an electoral story. A story about whether the people who were promised relief are going to feel relief before the next time they're asked to vote. And right now, based on everything J.D. Vance just said on camera, the answer to that question is no. At least not soon. That's a significant political liability. And the people managing this administration's political strategy are fully aware of it. Which raises its own question. Why make the admission at all? Why stand in front of cameras and confirm that prices are going up when you could have used more careful language? More hedged language? Language that left more room for optimism? There are a few possible explanations. One is that the data is so clear, and the trajectory so obvious, that trying to spin it would have been more damaging than admitting it. That being caught later having minimized a problem is worse politically than owning it up front. Another possibility is that the admission was strategic. That by getting ahead of the bad news, the administration is trying to frame rising prices as a global phenomenon beyond their control rather than a domestic policy failure. That's a defensible communication strategy. It shifts the frame from incompetence to external forces. But here's the problem with that strategy in this specific context. The $200 billion Iran war request is sitting right next to it. And it's very hard to simultaneously argue that global oil prices are beyond your control while also pursuing a military strategy that every energy economist agrees will directly impact global oil prices. Those two arguments cancel each other out. You can't claim helplessness in the face of market forces while also being the actor most capable of destabilizing the market. That contradiction is not going unnoticed by the people watching this closely. Economists, energy analysts, foreign policy experts, and ordinary voters are all looking at the same two data points and drawing the same conclusion. These things are connected, and the administration's messaging hasn't found a convincing way to address that connection yet. There's also a longer-term question lurking beneath this immediate moment. What does a post-conflict energy landscape look like? Proponents of a more aggressive posture toward Iran have argued that resolving the Iranian nuclear question once and for all would ultimately stabilize the region and create better long-term conditions for energy markets. That argument has some historical support. Prolonged uncertainty is also bad for markets. A definitive resolution, whatever form it takes, can sometimes produce stability that ongoing tension cannot. But that argument requires a level of public patience and economic endurance that is very difficult to sustain when people are already stretched thin. It requires people to accept short-term pain for long-term gain. And the track record of that argument in American politics is not encouraging. Every time it has been made, about every major military commitment of the past several decades, the short-term pain has been real and immediate. The long-term gain has been complicated, delayed, or disputed. And the people who bore the short-term pain most heavily were rarely the people who made the decision to pursue it. That pattern, repeated enough times, produces a specific kind of public skepticism. A skepticism that is now deeply embedded in the American political psyche. And it's that skepticism that makes the combination of a $200 billion war request and a gas price spike admission so politically combustible right now. Because it activates a memory. A collective memory of being told that sacrifice now will produce benefit later. And of watching the benefit not arrive on schedule. Whether this situation will follow that same pattern is genuinely unknown. The geopolitical circumstances are different. The actors are different. The strategic logic is different. But the emotional resonance of the moment is identical. And emotional resonance, in democratic politics, is often more powerful than strategic logic. That's where we are today. A White House requesting $200 billion for a potential conflict with Iran. A vice president confirming on camera that gas prices will continue to climb. A public doing the math. And a political conversation that has shifted in a way that will not easily shift back. Whether this administration is prepared to give the answers that the people asking these questions need, that remains to be seen. But the conversation has changed. The $200 billion is on the table. The gas prices are going up. J.D. Vance said so himself. And millions of Americans are sitting with both of those facts right now, trying to figure out what it means for them personally. For their budgets, for their futures, for their trust in the people who asked for their votes. That's where we are today. And the story is far from over.